Hello, everyone, and welcome to Irenicast. We are a weekly podcast of post-evangelical ministers and theological thinkers grappling with our place in the progressive Christian world. Thank you for joining us for another conversation on faith and culture. I'm your host, Jeff, and usually with me are my co-hosts Mona and Alan, but today we have a special guest. He is a fellow podcaster doing some of the best work in the space. He is co-host of the Liturgists Podcast, host of Ask Science Mike, and now, in addition to being a podcaster, he is the author of the new book, Finding God in the Waves. He is Mike McHargue, a.k.a. Science Mike. Mike, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
I can't imagine how insane your schedule has been over the last few weeks, so we're super grateful for your time.
I had a real surreal moment the other day when my assistant was talking to Michael's assistant about when to record the Liturgists Podcast. And there wasn't time to do so.
Oh goodness!
So it's been wild. It's good. It's exciting. But yeah, the tour has been. I kind of sent out a call saying I was putting on a tour. I'd like to hit 5 or 6 cities, and we had a lot more response than that. So
wow,
that's been wild.
Yeah, that's great. So was the surreal thing the fact that you couldn't find the time, or that you were communicating through assistants?
Both and. Yeah. It's been, I'm only home a couple of days a month right now. And the days I'm home, it's typically from the first thing in the morning till the very end of the day, back to back to back to back interviews.
Oh, wow.
And so we actually tried just like a late night recording session, and I was so tired I couldn't say anything interesting or intelligent. I just kind of sat silent on the line.
Oh, man.
So it was wild.
Well, hopefully it's you've had well rest and.
Oh, you're good. You're in the early part of the day relative to some of the stuff that happens. I'm a morning person, so.
Oh, good.
I'm sharp until about 3 p.m. at which point I start turning into a pumpkin.
Sweet. Then it sounds like we got the good time slot.
You did, totally. By the way, I love the name of your show.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it was my co-host Alan. He started a blog, Irenicon. And he was trying to get me to write for it for the longest time. And I'm not a writer. So I was like, well, maybe a podcast. And then it just so we just played on the word Irenicon and went that direction.
Oh, I love it.
Thank you. Before we get into some of the meat of your book, I had a couple serious questions for you.
Let's do it.
The first one is, within your book, you mention in passing comics, and it's always in the context of Marvel. And I'm just wondering, where is the DC love?
Batman. I love Batman.
I think that about answers where you're at with that.
I mean, I don't know. I guess Superman can be interesting. He's a tough character to write.
Yes.
But just as a kid, I was kind of captivated by Marvel characters more than the DC universe. You kind of had this Russian nesting dolls of power in the Marvel universe. And I got really captivated by the increasingly impossible villains. And you eventually get to a scale where like Galactus is a minor player. And it's just something about that fascinated me.
Interesting. All right. And you mentioned in your book that you built your own Ghostbusters proton pack. And I was wondering that when you played Ghostbusters with your friends, which Ghostbuster were you?
We were ourselves. I mean, that was sort of the trick.
Oh.
We weren't in Manhattan, so we were a local Tallahassee Ghostbusters franchise.
Nice. Okay. That's good. I like it. So I'm sure, as someone who has made a pretty good space for yourself answering questions, do you find that there are questions that you are asked that you sort of dread, or maybe even just a little tired of having to answer, especially in the midst of interview after interview after interview?
I don't know that there's any that I'm tired of answering. I dread, people like to give me like unanswered questions at the intersection of science, philosophy, and theology. And I don't have any answers to those questions either. I guess maybe I'm really good at articulating I don't know in a compelling manner. And that's why people keep asking me. But those are tough. Also, questions that I know I can't take at face value because the asker is using a reference frame that will render my answer nonsensical. So I have to go through this like rather convoluted process of building a epistemological bridge between the asker and where I want to take my answer, which leads to, a 10-minute answer to a relatively simple question. And I just worry that people listening get bored. It's not that I don't like doing it. In a lot of ways, I think people can't learn. Most people don't want to learn if they're not entertained as they do. So I'm always watching out for when you're not making good radio.
So for those of our listeners that may not be familiar, and I'm sure this is kind of the standard question you're getting a lot in the beginning of these interviews, but for those that might not be familiar with your story, how did you get into this space and what brought you to this place of being an author and a relatively known figure within the, I guess, progressive Christian space?
Yeah, it beats the hell out of me, really. Everything I've been doing has been a personal search. So I grew up in the Southern Baptist Church and became an atheist as an adult. Then I had this kind of crazy mystical encounter with God that I couldn't make sense of. And when I tried to make sense of it using traditional wisdom traditions like Christianity, it only made my confusion deepen. So I started studying cosmology and quantum physics and neuroscience specifically to answer questions about God. And I found things in that gave me enough comfort to start exploring Christianity again. And that was all completely personal, but I started to figure out that other people had these same questions. So I would talk to them if I thought, people needed to talk. Like literally locally, I would go to lunch with people and talk to them about my experience so that they could kind of use it as it helped them and disregard it as it didn't. And that just kept scaling and scaling and scaling and scaling until you reach now where I have like a book on bookshelves and all across the world. I mean, that's real weird if you think about it. Like I wrote some things down and now they get shipped in boxes all over the country and all over the world, and people pull it off a shelf and think about buying it. And I have a podcast that gets downloaded hundreds of thousands of times per month, or over 1 million times per month in the case of the Liturgists Podcast. And I do all these events and they keep selling out. And it's the weirdest thing to have never thought, ooh, I should build a platform. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure.
And be doing what I'm doing. Because I'm just trying to help people find peace on their own journey with God. That's it. That's all I'm up to.
So how has, with your story going from a personal experience into something that you started to tell your closest friends and family, and then into sharing bits and pieces on the podcast, all the while writing the story, and now that the story's out and kind of re-talking about it in all these interviews and different settings, how has, if at all, that story been reframed for you as you kind of reflect on it and retell it over and over again?
It's not my story anymore. I've offered it over to others. I have more memory of telling the story than many of the events themselves. Other than that moment on the beach, that will probably always be a centering point of my life. But when you put your life on the lab bench and shine bright lights on it and turn it into a product, essentially, you're giving it over to other people. So those words, that narrative, is now more defined by people's personal response to it than my own response to it.
And is that something you had to maybe come to terms with? Was there a grieving in that as you kind of gave away a part of your life to others?
No, there hasn't been. But there has been an increased care with stories that happened after that book about what I share and what I don't. And not to be a private person, but just some of my stories, I think I need them, so I hold on to them.
Yeah, so there are places and things that you've held to yourself, and you will continue to do so to kind of keep your connection to it?
Many. Yeah, and I'm probably exceptionally open compared to many people on the public figure spectrum. But there's things I intentionally hold back. Not out of shame, mind you.
But out of personal, just...
Yeah, little moments with God.
Yeah.
Things that happen with my family. Things that happen with friends. Even some things that would be instructive or helpful to other people, I kind of selfishly hold on to.
Selfishly is probably a strong word for that. I think we're all entitled to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we all are. I just,
Has that been one of the, maybe, it seems like it's been a relatively like quick thrust into the limelight as a public figure, and has that been one of the bumps in the road, just kind of figure out what you're going to keep for yourself and what you're going to share with others?
I know a good story involves drama and tension, but I don't want to manufacture somewhere none exists.
Yeah.
It's pretty easy for me to know the things I'm not ready to share yet. And my transition into public figuredom, whatever that is, has been relatively easy compared to people I know who've done the same thing. The people who follow my work but don't know me tend to be very kind and gracious and thoughtful. And when people offer criticism or critique of my work, they tend to do so very thoughtfully and graciously. I read a 2-star review of my book, which went through great pains to talk about how much the person appreciated my story, my perspective, and the way I relate to people. I think that's the best example of what my experience has been like. And I know from talking to other people, that's not how everyone's experience is, but it is certainly how mine has been, in that I have conservative Christians, progressive Christians, spiritual and not religious folks, agnostic folks, and atheist folks, all kind of following along and talking with me, but all doing so very compassionately and very thoughtfully.
And did that surprise you at all?
Yes, especially the conservative Christians. A lot of the things that I talk about in the way I understand God are very far from conservative Christian theology. And when I look at the way groups like that have responded to, friends of mine, they've really gotten a lot of fire. And I haven't. I still get invited to speak at conservative churches. I still regularly have phone calls with pretty significant leaders in conservative Christianity that are gracious. And it's not that I'm hiding what I believe or they're hiding what they believe. It's just somehow we're learning to have a dialogue where the foundation is mutual respect.
That's great. That's really great to hear, because it's easy to hear the stories of people who have been thoroughly rejected and treated very poorly by their former religious tradition. And that's great. I've heard you say in interviews and in the book, you're very gracious and loving in the way you speak about everyone, especially your former church. And I really appreciated that. I think it was it's something a lot of people need to hear, that it's not all that. And the perspective and framing that you provide for perhaps why people are in that space is also very, very helpful. And one of the things in the way you communicate seemed to kind of happen by accident were your axioms, that one of those things where you held personally, and it spoke to so many people that it became kind of a something that more people wanted to hear about. So could you describe a little bit how your axioms came to be and what a couple of them are? Sure.
I had this experience with God that was just crazy. I mean, you have to read the book to get the nuance of it, but I mean, it was really, really weird and profound and seemingly supernatural, and it just didn't fit my worldview at all. So, yeah, I have this moment in this bright light of God where I just feel like I'm literally in God's presence, and I mean literally in the old sense of the world, not the new sense where literally is emphatically, but I mean literally as in, grounded in factual experience. And I thought I had a brain tumor or something. It just didn't make any sense that I could be in God's presence, because there's no such thing as God. So as I tried to explore that experience through scripture or through theology or Christian faith and practice, I felt ridiculous. I just felt like a 35-year-old man standing in line to see Santa Claus at the mall. So I needed to find some rational basis, if there was any, for believing in God or trying to pray or do these things. So that's why I started to study different fields of science, was to see, is there anything to the idea of God? And I ultimately found justification for using the word God unironically, praying, what does Jesus mean? All those things that could be defended empirically. An empirical grounding for Christian faith and practice that, by the way, falls really far short of Orthodox Christianity or creedal Christianity. But I use these axioms basically to quiet my inner skeptic so that I could pray, because I learned that prayer was good for my brain. So whether God existed or not, I wanted to explore prayer, but I couldn't pray while doubting I was praying to God. Like, am I just talking to myself? Am I just think about over and over asking yourself, am I talking to myself, and how well can you focus? So that's what the axioms were for. I wrote them down in my own notebook, kind of iterated them as I learned new things. And I never intended them for anyone else. And then they became, at the time, the most discussed thing I'd ever done, just because I told a couple of people about them who had their own kind of public figure platforms. And so they ended up in the book. And what the funny thing is, I don't really use them anymore. I don't have that same kind of intense doubt towards my own experiences because I hold them so loosely. There's really not a lot to doubt. But it's been interesting to me to see how many people, especially people in a post-evangelical context, find those axioms to be incredibly helpful and comforting.
Yeah, they're really great. And I'm glad you put the list of them in the back of the book, along with actual references to your chapters. I can't tell you how nice that's been to actually have like a place to go when you hear, Christian Living Book talk about, this study or this study, and then to be able to go check it out was nice.
Yeah, well, if people are going to call me Science Mike, I have to take that seriously.
Yeah.
And on my podcast, on Ask Science Mike, I've always taken great pains to include the reference material to support whatever I said on the show. And I wanted to do the same in the book. But I didn't want footnotes, because footnotes really mess up narrative flow, in my opinion. And it's not an academic book. So the book just has a notes section in the back where I'll kind of quote the sentence I'm talking about and then give more context and resources for people who want to dig deeper.
Very helpful. So with the axioms, the journey of those coming from this idea of I need to be able to have a better context or a better definition or framing for this word so that I can participate in it. When for you does a word, because of all the cultural baggage and misrepresentation, when do you feel like, or for you, or even just Christianity in general, when do you feel like is an appropriate time to say, all right, this word is so damaged that, and not even an axiom can I guess redeem it?
I don't know that any word's beyond redemption. I mean, look at what our Black friends and brothers and sisters have done with that terrible N-word. They've redeemed it inside their culture. They turned it into a sign of intimacy and friendship. It's not redeemed to the point where white folks can use it, and may never be. But if they can redeem that word, I don't know. I mean, language is just something we all make up together. We decide what words mean. We decide how we respond to them. And, like a word like God, it transcends Christianity anyway. And its definition has always been up to considerable debate and disagreement. That's not new.
Yeah. It's interesting that you use the N-word as an example. One of the things I think that has been nice to hear from the work that you're doing is really specifically addressing the idea of race and the reality of racism and the importance to speak against it. Outside of just reading or where you are philosophically, what has really shaped and driven you in that area? Have you had specific experiences that have really made race an important issue for you?
Yeah, when I was a little kid, it was white kids that kicked my ass all the time. And the only person we weren't friends, but we were at least friendly acquaintances. But the only person who would play with me in my elementary school was a Black child. And then in middle school, it was this young Black man who had been held back many times, was much older than the rest of our class, who stopped me in the hall one day and asked me if I was prejudiced. in a somewhat confrontational way, and in my very bookish way, I said, absolutely not. Prejudice is the byproduct of weak minds.
Nice.
And he just nodded his head and walked away. And the next time I was on the playground, and two of my worst bullies had me pinned to the ground with their knees in my back, he walked over and pushed them down and said, if you mess with him, you mess with me. And from that point on, I sort of just followed him around campus all the time. So I had this, for someone raised in the South, I had maybe a different expectation from a lot of my peers, in that I associated Black people with physical safety and not with threat. But that led me to a very colorblind view on race. It didn't lead me to be justice-minded. It wasn't until later, as I was trying to reassemble any sort of theological beliefs, that it was Black friends of mine who introduced me to liberation theology and different ways of approaching the biblical text that were compelling and powerful and not so sullied by the worst parts of Enlightenment thinking. And that made it a matter of faith for me to pursue the same kind of justice that it seems Jesus himself pursued. And that was the liberation of the oppressed from the oppressor.
You talk a lot about, in your book, this idea of, and forgive me for oversimplifying, I'm still dipping my toe in neurology and physics and all that kind of stuff. I was never...
Me too.
Never into science growing up, so it's been a later thing that I've gained interest in. You almost describe the sense that you can create your own spiritual reality through, for lack of a better term, brain training.
Yeah, that's what everyone does. I just put a fine point on it and explain it. But that's what everyone does when they form spiritual beliefs, or when they feel they relate to God.
I don't know if you've gotten this question, but in times where I've tried to kind of talk to people about some of the stuff that I've read from you, and then what other stuff that you have kind of guided me to with some of the stuff you put out there, is where's that line for you, or how would you articulate the line between, we're framing this to something along the lines of, wishful thinking, or just, the power of positivity, creating what you want when you want it, space star ordering, whatever you want to call, just making things happen based on the power of your mind?
Well, you're not making anything happen. First of all, you are influencing how you view the world, but you're not making anything happen outside of your mind. So, I don't think if you believe, then suddenly good things start happening to you, or anything like that. So that would be one line. And the second thing is, this isn't just how your brain relates to God. It's kind of how your brain relates to everything. Your brain is 86 billion neurons, and your consciousness is a story those neurons are telling themselves. So you've never seen the world. You've never experienced reality. Your senses have sampled little bits of reality and then made an art project that roughly approximates what's happening in the real world. But you don't have to look very far into the sciences to see the ways that you are not objective, and that your senses are deeply limited in what they present to you. So all you're doing is building this map, this model of reality, and you have some ability to influence that with intention. And how you relate to other people, you make choices about what parts of their objective reality you pay attention to and incorporate into your model of them, and which ones you don't. And you do that for everything you buy, everything you eat. And I'm just elucidating that process clearly for people in respect to God, so that people who want to have some encounter with God but feel very skeptical understand the road, kind of the path they can take to get back to those experiences. But what I'm not saying is this is the way to uncover some ultimate or empirical truth about God.
Along with that, when you share your story, one of the kind of common themes throughout that space between, as a conservative evangelical into more of a progressive Christian, that transition through atheism, it seems so painful. And you use the word grief and loss a lot through that experience because, like we talked about earlier, you had such a positive experience and you still think fondly on your religious upbringing. Do you think that without that, you might have had that experience on the beach and it had been more easy to explain it away and try to continue down the path you were on before that?
Gosh, I don't know if I can answer that. It's like trying to, ask someone if you'd been born colorblind. It's such a different frame shift. I don't know that I have the ability to imagine a world where I don't have that context and what I would be like. And I don't mean to dodge the question. I don't think I have a meaningful answer. It's a great question. It's just past my ability to imagine.
Yeah. It's hard to delve into hypotheticals. So yeah, no, I get that for sure. When you were going through your time, I guess time in between, and you're talking about living essentially 2 years pretending to be something you're not, you mentioned it was incredibly isolating. And once you finally kind of let that go, and you mentioned the conversation with your wife and how difficult that was, and even mentioning leading your daughter to Christ during a place where you didn't even yourself really believe that. What would be some of the things you would recommend for someone after all that in rebuilding and re-establishing those relationships that have been not fake for so long, but not as deep as they could have been or should have been?
Grieve the loss of what was. You've got to come to terms with that sense of loss and grief, and people tend to ignore it or repress it. And then they email me and say, God feels distant. And then if I talk to them or email them back or meet them at an event, then they'll also tell me that their family feels distant, that they don't enjoy TV like they used to, that all their feelings feel distant. It's like, oh, guess what? You're depressed because you have this unresolved grief and trauma in your life. And trying to protect you, your brain is distancing you from all your emotions. So, of course, God feels distant. Everything feels distant. That's called situational depression versus the more well-known clinical depression. But both are dark experiences. So you've got to start with the grief and the loss. You've got to get people in your life who you can be honest with, who will accept you and not judge you and not spend their time trying to convince you to believe in some very particular way about very particular theological ideas. That's not helpful. And then as you've done that, you need to make changes in your life that allow you to be who you are all the time. And some people who knew you like you were before, who knew you when you believed more conventional things about God or things more similar to that community, can't handle the fact that you've changed. And no matter what's happening in your life, all they will want to talk about is the ways in which you have fallen away. And that's when you have to set up boundaries in your life. Some people simply can't keep going on the journey with you. And it's not that you resent those people. It's not that you wish them ill. It's just that you can't continue to live your life with them trying to pull you back to where you were. So your friends, the people you spend time with, are the ones who love you for you, the ones who celebrate both who you are and who you are becoming. Now, that's not to say surround yourself with yes men. You also need people who can call you out when your behaviors are harmful or destructive to yourself or to other people. But good friends will never spend all of their time admonishing you. They'll spend most of their time just being your friend.
Which boundaries were the most difficult for you, or which part of that advice was most difficult for you in that journey of kind of reestablishing I guess in a sense, your agency. Like, here's who I am. I'm putting it out there like that.
I had to learn that some people, I couldn't take the lunch invitation, that I shouldn't respond to every text, that some relationships needed distance. I mean, there were people who would say they wanted to catch up over lunch, and I'd get there and there'd be like 4 or 5 or 6 people, and they'd have their Bibles out, and it was actually like a Jesus intervention.
Oh, wow.
It's not healthy, and it's not helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So I just stopped returning those people's calls, and I hit ignore when the phone would ring. Other people, it's great if I see them at social functions and gatherings, and I walk over to them and I catch up and things are great. But they're not people I could, go over to their house for dinner anymore. And I've lost a lot of friendships like that used to be very near and very dear. And you have to grieve that. Now, I've noticed today that as my work is becoming more well known, some of those people are trying to reconnect with me. And it seems to be out of some misplaced fascination with the reach of my work. And in that case, I don't know it's necessarily healthy to reinvest in those relationships because the dynamic won't be healthy. It's all tough, though. I mean, there's hundreds of people in my city that used to be near and dear that have become acquaintances. And I had to spend a couple of years, not months, a couple of years grieving that and working through it in therapy.
So from the whole process, from kind of the beginning, because the catalyst for your kind of driving you into the story or this journey was your parents' divorce. How long from that point till now has it been?
Oh boy, I have no idea. I have it written down somewhere. Let's see. I don't really pay attention to the passage of time in any significant sense. So it can be very difficult for me to answer questions like that. But if you hold on just a second, I'm literally opening up the timeline of my life I had to write in order to do the book. And it looks like my parents' divorce was final in 2009 in November.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It's been a while.
Now, is that a personal decision just to put your mind on other things, or is that just the way your brain works?
I'm learning disabled in some pretty serious ways. And one of those ways is I have very little episodic memory. And episodic memory is closely correlated with being able to have a semblance of the passage of time. So if you put me in a room with a book and no clock, I have a hard time telling the difference between 20 minutes and 4 hours.
Oh, wow.
And
okay.
that gets the longer period of time. Like, so if something happened 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks, 2 months, and 2 years are pretty hard for me to tell apart. 2 months and 2 years, especially.
And has that been something that's always been kind of a part of your journey?
Oh, yeah, my whole life.
Is it jarring being told that you have a learning disability and then being kind of known as, I assume, the smartest guy in the room everywhere you go?
Yeah, I laugh all the time because it's been happening since before Science Mike. But people would say, "Oh, Mike, he's the smartest guy I know," and it just makes me laugh because there's so many things that people do with an ease that seems magical to me. That I've always kind of self-identified as foolish or behind the curve. I mean, early in elementary school, the question was not whether I was gifted or not, but whether I belonged in remedial classes.
Wow.
So it is very funny that people think of me as intelligent in some exceptional way, because it's definitely not my lived experiences. I do read very fast. I do remember a lot of what I read. I am good at synthesizing information and explaining complicated things. But if I watch my wife make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich without getting peanut butter all over her forearms, I'm impressed every time. I mean, just multiplied by anything in your life. Like when people can say, "Oh yes, I have a doctor's appointment on Tuesday." I'm like, how did they do that? Like it mystifies me.
Wow. So you read a timeline, you're much more aware of the time that has passed than if you actually experience that time.
pretty much dates slide right off my brain all the time, even if I read them. So I have good synthetic memory, but very poor episodic. So even if I read things that are episodic, I take the synthesis of the information, but not the ordering of events or their timing. So if you ask me about Harry Potter, for example, it's very difficult for me to tell you what happened in which book of the Harry Potter series. But to tell you the themes of Harry Potter, I can do it all day.
Are there things that you have to shift when you're reading and reading and researching seem to come pretty easy to you. So what have you done to kind of compensate for that other side?
Well, there's a reason I'm a technology guy. Computers have always excelled at what my brain does not from their earliest iterations. It's hard for me to write, but I can press a key and form a letter. It's hard for me to know dates, but my calendar never forgets. So I'm very regimented about getting things I'm not good at out of my brain and into digital systems that support me. So 10 minutes before a conversation like this, I get tapped on the wrist and I look down and there's a little notification that says, hey, you've got, this podcast at 1:00. So go do it. And there's other things I learned. I went to a learning specialist late in high school, and she gave me some tips and tricks on how to help, some of my learning deficiencies and disabilities. I tend to, in conversation with people as I'm looking at them, close caption whatever they're saying to give my much more powerful visual memory a shot at remembering what they're saying, instead of letting my very poor auditory memory immediately forget. Things like that.
Your passion and your drive towards really looking at faith and life and everything through the lens of neuroscience, is that, I'm sure it's been helpful in that area, but also just in general, is that maybe part of the motivation and why that particular area is so fascinating for you?
I don't know. It's not anything I've thought of. When I was diagnosed with all this stuff, neuroscience was frankly a lot more primitive. I mean, we've made remarkable, you're talking 24, 25 years ago that I was tested for this stuff. So brain imaging wasn't anything like it is now back then. So I haven't actually done a lot of studying into my particular learning disorders and what neuroscience may have to say, although you've probably just inspired a few hours of research.
Well, I don't know whether to say sorry or you're welcome.
Oh, it's my jam. It's my favorite thing. So
nice. So you've talked in that realm, you've talked a lot about the idea of neurotheology. I don't think I heard that term before starting to listen to your stuff. Is that something that you kind of have coined with your approach to Christianity, or is that a discipline that's growing? And I don't want to say legitimate discipline, but I guess legitimate discipline that's growing that you could direct people to or recommend?
Well, to be clear, if I would have coined neurotheology, it definitely would not be a legitimate discipline. It would be like a thing a writer came up with to explain something. But neurotheology is an actual discipline, and there's several people who have kind of forced that forward as a field of study. Probably the most notable, in my opinion, would be Andrew Newberg. But even, someone, like Michael Persinger in the 80s, although his work has been widely critiqued and criticized under peer review. But he at least tried to take a rigorous approach to understanding spiritual experiences in the context of the brain. And it's more people like Newberg, or there's another guy, V.S. I am almost terrified to say his name because I'll get it wrong, but V.S. Ramachandran, he's Indian, does really incredible stuff with neurotheology. So it's a real field with real neuroscientists.
And is it strictly at this point a scientific field? Like, are there philosophers and theologians that are...
It is purely scientific. It is not a study of God. It is a study of what beliefs about God do to human brains. As so many things in the sciences today, I don't know that philosophers or theologians would be greeted warmly if they attempted to write papers in the field or anything like that. Although they certainly, of course, could offer commentary.
Do you see any cross in those two fields? I especially in terms of, I guess, when we talk about consciousness and stuff like that, it seems to have been weighed in for so long by philosophers and theologians. And now that we have kind of a physical, or we're starting to develop a physical map for that, do you see more of a cross section in that area?
What area specifically?
Neurotheology, I guess, where there's more of a collaboration between the two sides in how to at least communicate some of the truths that are discovered through that?
It's a relatively small field. So you're just talking about, a couple dozen neuroscientists so far. So no, I haven't seen a lot of collaboration. I mean, I've spoken to some of the researchers in the field, and they're open to that, probably largely because I can help popularize their work. I do see, when you talk about consciousness, there's certainly a lot of interplay between philosophers and cognitive scientists and neuroscientists. But that's less developed in studying our relationship to God. At least as far as I'm aware, science is a big field.
For people that might be interested in starting to delve into that realm of physics and neuroscience, are there some introductory resources that you could recommend to people to kind of get started without feeling so overwhelmed that they quit immediately?
I did try to make my book a great primer and to include notes in the back for accessible resources. I'll give you two books if you're interested that are pretty accessible. One is How God Changes Your Brain by Andrew Newberg, which is very accessible as an introduction to neurotheology. And then kind of the intersections of physics and consciousness in the brain. Michio Kaku's The Future of the Mind is excellent.
And what about physics?
Physics in general, or physics as it relates to consciousness?
Physics in general.
Physics in general. Oh, man, there's such good books. A Universe from Nothing by Lawrence Krauss. It's really good. No physics books are super accessible.
That's what I figured.
But as a physics book goes, that one's good. Brian Greene's The Fabric of the Cosmos would also be another good one. But just get ready for dizzy spells. Get ready to read paragraphs 20 or 30 times in a row to set the book down and come back later while your brain kind of cooks on it. If you're new to physics, I don't know if what they call physics books for popular audiences tend to still be very brain bending. And it will be especially difficult if you try to force physics through a set of theological assumptions.
Yeah.
Best to set those aside for a moment and approach physics as physics.
It seems like a discipline that can easily been misused. Like I remember growing up and even still hearing these scientific nuggets shoved into an approach towards God, and then only to find out that whatever science was applied was either not good science or only a fraction of whatever that whole concept was supposed to be.
Yeah, it's very common when the church encounters science is to manipulate and abuse it for a particular theological claim.
Any tips on how to avoid getting sucked into, I guess, pop science or?
New claims are new for a reason. Don't pin your science interest on the newest, latest findings. Approach new findings in science with skepticism. Wait for other experts to weigh in over time. Stick with established, known scientists working for respected institutions, and be ready to be wrong a lot.
So how do you determine what is a reputable scientist and a reputable source?
There's a book called The Information Diet. Go check it out. Yeah, it would be a longer. I can't give you a 2-minute or 5-minute answer on that. That's a discipline in and of itself.
Nice. That's good. That's great. I'm going to check that out. Was the exercise in writing this book, was it something that you needed to get out, or was it also a purposeful attempt because you wanted to get into the space of being an author? Like, is this a goal that you've created for yourself? I guess what I'm asking is, can we expect another book?
You can expect another book, but not because I wanted to be an author. I told my story so often And I knew if I wasn't careful, 40 years from now, I'll still be telling that same story. So I wanted to get it into a format where people could grab the story and encounter it on their own terms in their own time. And frankly, let me move on to things that have happened in my life after that story. But yeah, I've got several books outlined, and you'll see more Science Mike books.
Nice. That's good to know. And has the experience so far in the book tour strengthened that desire to want to get those out there?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the touring's my favorite part. I'm a communicator who writes. I'm a speaker who writes, not a writer who hesitantly goes to events. I like seeing people in person. That's my favorite thing about it. So I'd love to keep doing tours. The books are an excuse to go on tour, really.
I hear that a lot from musicians, that the album's just an excuse to
I love
get out there.
And it also, honestly, this book is not just, some people have heard my story or listened to the podcast. It's not just a collection of greatest hits from my work. It's its own thing. There are many topics that I've only discussed in the book and never anywhere else. And nowhere else have I gone into the same depth on those topics, including topics you may have heard me speak on, as I do in the book. I've had a lot of people tell me, I bought the book just to support the podcast, and I was surprised. It's a really great book. And it's not just a bonus feature for the podcast. It is a standalone narrative, and it's meant to be a kind of a defining resource for people who are either trying to find their way back to a God they're skeptical toward, or people who are trying to understand this incredible transformation in Western thinking away from institutional organized religion, basically the rise of the nones, the no religious affiliation crowd. I think that the book serves both of those purposes really well.
Agreed. As someone who listens to your podcast on a regular basis and read the book, I was pleasantly surprised that it wasn't just a recap of stuff that I've already heard, but I'm getting a lot out of it and already recommending it to people to read, especially people from my old religious context, just as a framework for saying, I know we don't have any understanding, but here's just a glimpse of a good pathway for how my thinking has changed over time. More of just an understanding bridge sometimes than anything else, as opposed to trying to convince someone that they're still wrong.
Oh, that's great. I really wanted it to be a book that helped create better language for those kinds of bridge conversations.
Yeah. I really liked what you said in the book regarding that, is that we tend to talk at the other side instead of talk with the other side. I think your book is a fantastic resource for creating those bridges. So mission accomplished.
Awesome.
Well, where can people find you?
Well, they can learn all about the book if they'd like to hear more about it at findinggodinthewaves.com, including a series of videos that explores questions and topics addressed in the book. If you'd like to connect to me and the other work that I do, just go to AskScienceMike.com and click on the tab up top that says work. And from there, you can get to everything I do. You can get to my blog, both my podcasts, as well as places to connect to me on social media.
And we will have all of that information in the show notes at irenicast.com/87. You'll find all the links there for that. So, Mike, thank you so much for coming on. I can't thank you enough. And I hope that you continue to have great success in your books and your podcast.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Take care.